Good evening, my young scholars. This is now round 4 of me trying to record this podcast, as Lily is very vocal in her enthusiasm for this topic as we're focusing on the rise of Europe. We'll be focusing on trade and communication, diffusion of crops, as well as pathogens from the east to the western hemisphere, and social, economic, religious, and gender aspects. So we are starting with the mills and mines, and the word of the night is serialization. That refers to broad changes in agricultural techniques that result in more land under cultivation and a larger crop yield. Before 1000, farmers realized that land loses its fertility if the same crop is planted again and again. So you begin rotating out crops, you find some that are naturally going to replenish the soil, such as oats, and you rotate. This will lead to the 3-field method: plant two crops in one field, oats in the other, as well as eventually the enclosure movement, but we'll talk about that one later. Farmers also began using sheep, horses, and cows in their farming. And after 1000, farmers added iron to their wooden plows. Between 500 and 1000, you have the water wheels, and then you actually have windmills. The debate for the windmill is anywhere between 1200 and 1500, but there is evidence of a primitive water wheel in about 850 showing up in larger European towns. Windmills were more powerful than water mills, but obviously they can only be used when there's a steady wind. Farming labor also involved the entire family, and some of these enterprises included textiles, tanning, quarrying. You also have mining and ironworking. Mills were expensive to build. Over time, they bring great profits. So if you're not working in the home, you're working at a mill. The results included greater productivity, but also environmental damage. That includes water pollution and deforestation. So take a look. We're on medieval Europe, and as you can see, we have early formations. The Holy Roman Empire, Normandy, France. You'll notice that Spain is not yet united. You have different kingdoms. You have England and Scotland, no Wales. Ireland, Poland, we'll come back to that. A non-united Italy. We'll talk about Italian unification later. And no Germany or Prussia. Obviously, that will come much, much later. The peasants, the population, and the plague. Europe's population boomed, going from 40 million to 75 million between the years 1000 and 1340. Serialization freed some people from working the land full-time, and market towns began appearing on the Mediterranean coast, along the English Channel, the Baltic Sea, and the Rhine River. Market towns first appeared around 1000. Prior to that, you had a lot of smaller farms, perhaps a market center, but now you're actually getting the market towns. Urban populations became dependent on the market for food rather than growing their own. And as a result, you're going to see urban artisans forming guilds to protect their interests. Increases in productivity changed society in different areas at very different times. Slavery almost disappeared as more people working the land became serfs. And most serfs lived in settlements either around a castle or a church. Lord serf society had been called, it has been called feudalism by historians, but it was not referred to as that in the medieval times. After 1000, society was also divided into more social orders. You had your lord, your knights, your clergy, and your serfs. And knights actually began training when they were children. Kings of this period were incredibly weak. I'll get into that a bit more later. States are very decentralized. Think of the manor, the lord of the manor. That's sort of his own little kingdom. In the 11th to 12th centuries, landowners often gave land to monasteries. And after 1000, primogeniture became the common system of inheritance. And we'll also talk about why that's a problem later on. The Black Death. Not a good way to go. Between 1315 and 1322, there was a great famine sweeping across Europe. And this weakens the population. And in 1346, rats infected with the Black Death traveled by ship to Kaffa on the Black Sea. By 1348, the plague reached Italy and France, and by 1349, Germany. Now let's talk about this for a minute. This plague would ravage Europe for 2 years, and then it would just periodically show up in the late 1300s and throughout the 1400s, causing substantial population decreases. Now, what you see in the top corner is what would be considered a plague doctor. And that mask is stuffed with herbs. It's believed that this would keep out the plague. But the issue is that people were dying faster than medical help could provide. Now, here's the thing, guys. The Black Death, aka bubonic plague, can be taken care of by some pretty intense antibiotics. It still exists. There are people every year who contract the bubonic plague. And actually, in World War II, Japan dropped bombs on China that contained fleas infected with this plague. Take a look at the map. You can see where major towns are being hit and what time period. The extent of the plague, regions impacted, and something else that you should know. The Black Plague, not a good way to die at all. Because here's the thing. There was a saying, you could see a friend for lunch and attend his funeral at dinner time. Once you contracted the plague, if you were lucky, the fever would kill you quickly, but they called it the Black Death because people would develop bulbuses, as they're called, wherever they had glands, and these would eventually burst with black blood. You were pretty much literally rotting from the inside out in a very short time period, followed by profuse vomiting, massive body aches, horrific fevers, and eventually you would die. Only about 10 to 20% of the people who contracted the bubonic plague actually survived. But what's interesting is there was a small town. They were infected with the plague, Elon. They knew that they were all probably going to die, so they actually shut themselves off from society. But a large number of them actually survived. And through their descendants, scientists have learned there are some people who are genetically immune to the plague, which I find very awesome. The plague, well, those who survived the plague, realized that there was more to life than just work. After all, YOLO. As a result of the plague, labor becomes more expensive because obviously, who are the first people that are going to die during a plague? It's going to be the peasants who are living in poor sanitary conditions. And this actually gives rise to a series of rebellions. And Wat Tyler's rebellion in England was actually one of the most famous, demanding higher wages and the end of serfdom. Rural living standards improved. The period for apprenticeship for artisans was reduced. Income per capita or income per person rose substantially. And you also have the idea of art. Now, obviously, as you can see, these paintings are not done to scale because that guy is not taller than his horse. It is not a pony. This is The Rebellion by Wat Tyler. And when we start talking about the Renaissance in this series, you're going to see the evolution of painting. Moving along to the trading cities. So you have a massive continuation of the expansion of trade outside of Europe. And after the plague, you'll see that rise significantly. But increases in trade contribute to the growth of cities after 1200. And the relationship among trade, manufacturing, and urbanization is seen by the growth of cities in northern Italy. There's a reason the Italian city-states become so wealthy. Crusaders would bring back information on the world outside of Europe. So you have one benefit to the Crusades. It's bringing back all that lost knowledge. Texts describing travels were extremely popular, and knowledge about the outside world will also come from trade networks, not just the lost works, but other cultures, other types of industry, especially other goods. Books described Asia as being full of wealth, and not just gold and silver, but in goods. The Venetian capture of Constantinople in 1204, the opening of the Central Asian caravan trade, post-Mongol development of the Mediterranean, trade with Constantinople, Beirut, and Alexandria all bring massive profits and growth specifically to Venice, because somehow that becomes the pit stop. That's the drop-off, that's the exchange point, and they really rise up in power. You'll also have the formation of the Hanseatic League in the Baltics and the North Seas. Flanders prospered in the wool industry. The town of Champagne, yeah, that's where it comes from, benefited from their position on the major land routes through France and the series of trade fairs that were sponsored by their nobles. You also have textile industries beginning in England and in Florence, especially Florence, and we'll talk about why Florence matters later on when we hit the Renaissance. Europeans made extensive use of water wheels and windmills in the textile, the paper industry, and then other industries as well. Textiles are going to be huge. Here's the thing, guys. The best cotton in the world, the most beautiful, the softest, the most decorated, doesn't come from Europe, comes from India. Keep that in mind. That will play a very important role when we touch on the Industrial Revolution. So European trade in the 1200s, you can really see it's focused quite a bit around Italy. You can also see there is some in France, major reason being great stops in between the rest of Europe. So Italy is the stop for Asia, Mediterranean Sea, and then France is a stop before you hit the UK region. Makes sense. And we're back on the Crusades. Let's talk about it for just a few minutes, shall we? The Crusades were all about the Holy Land, and there are 4 of them. Crusades occurred between 1095, when the Pope called for Christians to take Jerusalem, to 1291, when the last European holding in Syria was lost. As you guys know, 1095, you read this, Pope Urban II preaches to a large group of church leaders. The Crusades were all volunteers, without pay, and without a line of command. Of the 50,000 men who responded to the call, only 10,000 reached Jerusalem. And the Crusaders took Jerusalem after quite a bit of bloodshed in 1099. During the later Crusades, because again, I mentioned there are 4 of them, Saladin, who was the governor or the vizier, as you know that vocab word, overthrew the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, and he establishes his own, the Ayyubids. In 1187, Saladin raises an army of 30,000 mounted warriors. He then retakes Jerusalem and restores the mosques, and this begins the Third Crusade. So even though this act is what starts it, the Europeans declare yet another crusade to get Jerusalem back. It failed. In 1201, the Fourth Crusade attempted to drive the Muslims out of Jerusalem. In January 1203, en route to Jerusalem, the majority of the Crusader leadership entered into an agreement with the Byzantine prince Alexos Angelos. And the plan was that these knights would divert to Constantinople, as you know, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and they would work together to restore his father as emperor, because his father had been disposed of. The intention, after fixing this, the Crusaders would continue to the Holy Land with promised financial assistance and military assistance from the Byzantine Empire. In June 1203, the main Crusader fleet reached Constantinople. Here's the thing, guys. This is where it all falls apart. Upon reaching Constantinople, the Western Crusaders were no longer, how do I want to put this? They weren't getting paid anymore. Once they had actually restored Alexios Angelos' father as emperor, and he was actually crowned co-emperor, he was disposed of in a popular uprising in Constantinople. So they really don't want this family ruling, apparently. And because of this act, the Crusaders know they're not going to be paid. There's no military support. There is no financial support coming. And then Alexios is murdered. When he is murdered in February of 1204, the Crusaders and the Venetians decide that they're going to take over Constantinople. And they capture and ransack the entire city. And they set up a new Latin empire, and they partition off other Byzantine territories among themselves. And this is really how the Byzantine Empire is going to collapse, and the Ottomans will take the city away. We'll take the city of Constantinople. Because after 1204, individual European leaders attempted crusades. There's never a multinational effort after this. The Crusades led Europeans to think that it was acceptable to colonize foreign lands in the name of God for Christianity. This is going to play a really huge role later on. That mindset never truly goes away. And even in the 1800s, we're going to talk about the imperialist takeover of parts of Asia and pretty much the entire continent of Africa. And let's not forget South America, parts of North America. We'll get to it. We'll discuss it all, I promise you. It gets worse, though, guys. So, medieval Christians looked down on Jews who were banned from many occupations. They had to live in ghettos, and they were forbidden to marry Christians. Frequent attacks by Christians on Jews began in 1095. So Pope Urban's speech, hey, let's unite, let's begin the Crusades, it's the same year that attacks on the Jewish people begin. In 1208, Pope Innocent III approved an attack on Cathars. Cathars were Christian heretics. They had different beliefs than the Catholics, but keep in mind, they're still Christian. They're just the wrong kind of Christian. No, come back. There we go. And in 1208, as I said, this is when this begins, a special court is also created to hear charges of heresy. You've probably heard of it. It's called the Inquisition. Crusaders received permission in 1212 to fight non-Christians in Spain. Spain, not united, as I told you guys before with the map, was home to both Jews and Muslims, thus beginning the Reconquest. That leads us to Iberian unification and our last slide for this podcast. Spain and Portugal emerged as strong, centralized states through a process of marriage alliances, mergers, occasional warfare, and uniting for the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. The reconquest offered nobility large land estates. They can grow rich on these without actually having to do any work themselves because they can just have people who are already living on this land do the work for them. Isn't that nice? The Reconquest took place over a period of several centuries, but it picks up the pace after the Christians put the Muslims on the defensive with a victory in 1212. Portugal became completely established with specific boundaries in 1249. In 1415, the Portuguese would capture the Moroccan port of Ceuta, which gives them access to Saharan trade. On the Iberian Peninsula, Castile and Aragon were finally united in 1469 with the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand. And they began what's called the Reconquista, reconquest again, to a much more severe extent. Isabella herself dons on armor and joins her husband in battle. And in 1492, the Moors or Spanish Muslims were driven out of their last Iberian stronghold, which was called Granada, where Alhambra was built. In a ceremony, the key to Alhambra was placed on a silk pillow and ceremoniously given to Isabella. Spain then expelled all Jews and Muslims, unless they were willing to convert, from its territory over the next decade. Portugal would also begin expelling its own Jewish population. All right, that's where we're going to stop today on that very cheery note. As we've studied before and we'll keep studying, in the name of religion, humankind has killed each other. We've pushed each other out of territories. We have done incredibly despicable things. And as much as I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, it's not. Because The Jewish and Muslim population who choose to stay in Spain and not convert face the fires of the Spanish Inquisition. Thanks for listening. Appreciate y'all tuning in, and have a great night, guys. Cheers.